A chef who chose silence over fame. Fame usually arrives with noise. Interviews, headlines, invitations that promise immortality. But one chef turned away from all of it, and in doing so, became more influential than those who chase a spotlight. This is a story of a voice that never spoke, and a silence that echoed through the culinary world. At the height of his success, everything pointed upward. His restaurant was fully booked months ahead. Critics praised his restraint. Young chefs quoted his techniques as doctrine. Opportunities arrived daily. Television appearances, brand partnerships, global tours. The kind of momentum most chefs spend their lives pursuing had found him effortlessly. And then, without explanation, he disappeared. No announcements, no final interviews, no farewell. To understand why this silence mattered, we must return to the moment fame first entered his kitchen. He had never cooked to be seen. His obsession was clarity, removing everything unnecessary until only truth remained on the plate. His food was quiet, deliberate, almost austere. And in a world addicted to spectacle, that restraint felt revolutionary. Attention gathered not because he asked for it, but because people sensed something rare. But attention has weight. As cameras arrived, the kitchen changed. Not the food, but the air. Conversations felt monitored. Decisions felt interpreted. Every dish was no longer just a dish. It was a statement waiting to be explained. The chef felt something tightening around his craft. Fame was turning food into language, and he had never wanted to speak. Invitations came with conditions. Appear here. Comment there. Explain your philosophy. Simplify it. Package it. Repeat it. Each request seemed harmless alone. Together, they formed a cage built from visibility, and the chef began to realize something unsettling. If he kept speaking, his work would stop being experienced and start being consumed. That realization planted a quiet resolve. And soon, the chef would make a decision that confused the industry, frustrated the media, and redefined what influence could look like when silence is chosen deliberately. The invitations intensified as his silence grew. Producers framed his absence as mystery, promising respectful platforms if he would only speak. Sponsors offered protection from commercialization on their terms. Writers requested essays, manifestos, statements that could anchor his work in language the world could circulate. Everyone wanted a version of him they could hold, quote, and repeat. He declined all of it. Inside the restaurant, the staff felt the tension sharpen. Guests arrived with expectations shaped by articles they had read, interpretations they had absorbed secondhand. They wanted explanation alongside flavor. They asked questions at the table the chef had never intended to answer. The food still spoke clearly, but fewer people were listening. One night, a journalist arrived unannounced, notebook already open. They ordered carefully, ate slowly, then asked the chef by name. When the message reached the kitchen, the chef paused longer than usual before responding. He stepped into the dining room, stood quietly at the edge of the table, and listened as the journalist spoke. About influence, about legacy, about responsibility to the public conversation. When it was his turn to answer, the chef said only one sentence. "If I explain it, you will stop tasting it." He returned to the kitchen without another word. The article that followed was respectful, even admiring, but it marked a shift. Critics began framing his silence as arrogance. Commentators speculated about insecurity. Some accused him of hoarding meaning instead of sharing it. The industry, uncomfortable with what it couldn't categorize, began to turn. And still, he said nothing. As the noise grew louder, the chef felt his relationship with cooking change. Not in technique, but in intention. He cooked more slowly. He removed dishes that required explanation to be understood. He stripped the menu until only what could stand alone remained. If food could not speak for itself, it did not belong. But silence has consequences. Invitations stopped arriving. Coverage faded. New chefs replaced him in conversations about the future. The restaurant remained full, but no longer fashionable. The spotlight moved on, as it always does. And that was when the chef made his final, most difficult decision. He closed the restaurant. No press release. No farewell service. No explanation. Just a locked door and a handwritten note thanking those who came to taste rather than listen. The world assumed the story ended there. It hadn't, because silence, when chosen with intention, does not disappear. It travels quietly into the hands of those who understand it. And what followed would prove that influence does not always come from being heard, but from knowing when not to speak. In the months after the restaurant closed, the chef vanished completely. No consulting work, no pop-ups, no return appearances framed as the quiet comeback to the industry. It felt like a refusal to play the ending they had written for him. Speculation filled the silence he left behind. Some said he had burned out. Others claimed he had lost relevance and retreated before being forgotten. But none of those explanations captured the truth, because the chef never stopped cooking. He cooked in private kitchens, in borrowed spaces, in places without names or signage. He cooked for farmers after harvest, for families marking ordinary days, for young cooks who asked nothing except to watch his hands move. There were no menus, no photographs, no narratives attached, just food placed in front of people who were present enough to receive it. And something subtle began to spread. Chefs who spent time with him returned to their own kitchens changed. They spoke less during service. They explained less to diners. They trusted the plate to carry meaning without subtitles. Dishes became quieter, more focused, not imitative, but liberated, as if permission had been granted to stop performing. The culinary world noticed, but couldn't quite locate the source. Food writing began to shift tone. Fewer manifestos, fewer declarations, more space left between words. Critics struggled to describe what they were tasting. They wrote about restraint, about absence, about the feeling of being invited rather than instructed. The chef's silence had entered the culture, not as a statement, but as a method. Yet not everyone was comfortable with this influence. Institutions criticized the lack of accessibility. Media voices argued that withholding explanation was elitist, that refusing to speak created barriers instead of bridges. The chef heard these criticisms through others, but he never responded. He understood that silence, like food, could not satisfy everyone. It was not meant to. One evening, a young cook asked him why he never shared his philosophy publicly. The chef paused, then answered carefully. Because once something is named, he said, people stop experiencing it and start agreeing with it. That sentence stayed with the cook long after the meal ended. The chef's impact was now undeniable, but invisible. No awards tracked it. No rankings reflected it. Yet kitchens across the world were growing quieter, more intentional, less anxious to explain themselves. The tension was no longer about fame. It was about whether a culture built on commentary could survive an influence that refused to speak. And the world was about to test that silence one final time. The final test came without warning. A global culinary summit announced a special honor, one reserved for those who had reshaped the language of modern food. The chef's name appeared at the top of the list. The invitation was public, celebrated, impossible to ignore. Cameras waited. Panels prepared questions. The industry anticipated a moment of explanation that would finally give shape to the silence. He did not attend. No statement followed. No substitute appeared. Just absence. At first, the reaction was frustration. Commentators called it disrespect. Organizers felt embarrassed. Social feeds filled with demand for clarity. But then something unexpected happened. The summit continued without him, and felt strangely hollow. Panelists spoke longer. Slides multiplied. Words stacked upon words. Yet something essential was missing. The contrast was unmistakable. People realized they were talking about food more than tasting it. In the months that followed, the honor quietly lost relevance. Not because the chef rejected it, but because his refusal exposed a deeper hunger in the industry. A hunger for meaning that could not be satisfied by explanation alone. Silence had revealed how loud everything else had become. Meanwhile, the chef continued exactly as before, cooking quietly, teaching carefully, leaving no trail except in the hands of those who watched closely. His influence did not expand. It deepened, and in that depth, it became resilient to trends, commentary, and disappearance. Years later, when young cooks were asked who inspired them most, his name surfaced without ceremony, not as legend, not as icon, but as reference, as touchstone, as someone who proved that restraint could be louder than proclamation. He never returned to public life. He never clarified his intentions. He never explained his work. And that was the point, because in choosing silence over fame, he preserved the one thing attention would have taken from him: the ability to let food speak without interruption. In a world that demands constant commentary, his refusal became a lesson. Not every influence needs a voice. Not every truth needs an explanation. Sometimes, the most powerful statement is knowing when to say nothing at all. Subscribe to join the journey. A